against terror groups like ISIS inside Syria and Iraq. You see the White House there. You see the microphone. That is where we expect President Biden to speak in a matter of moments for now, after what can only be described as a dramatic development in the region. After a year and a half that has already seen, of course, many other dramatic developments. It is a region on edge. And this latest move here, the apparent toppling of Bashar Al-Assad, is significant. We expect to see President Biden momentarily, but until we do, let me bring in Ali Rafa, who's live for us here at the White House. And Ali, this will be the first time, of course, that we hear from President Biden since these overnight developments.
Yeah, Hallie, that's right. The White House in the 12 p.m. hour had announced that the president would deliver these remarks on the latest developments out of Syria after we know that he was briefed by his national security team this morning on the latest developments there, and overnight was kept briefed on what was going on there, as well as having conversations with regional partners like the leaders of Israel, Jordan, and Iraq, for example. And so we expect him to talk about not only what has happened, but really how the U.S. views this scenario and how this could potentially impact U.S. relations in that country. You can imagine that the United States, U.S. officials, as well as other democracies around the world, are waiting with bated breath to understand how this impacts their countries and what we could see coming out of Syria next with these rebel groups led by an Islamist group that the U.S. deems a terrorist organization. You can imagine there's questions over whether this could potentially be worse or better for the Syrian people and U.S. diplomatic ties than President Bashar al-Assad's regime. Now, amid all of this uncertainty, U.S. officials have said for a few days, even before this news overnight, that these rebel forces had taken over the capital city of Damascus. They said that their focuses were on a few things. They were focusing on ensuring that regional allies like Israel, Jordan, and Iraq were still strong and supported by the U.S. They also wanted to make sure that this situation didn't lead to a humanitarian crisis. And they also want to continue their work preventing ISIS activity in Syria. Remember, that is the main reason why the United States has roughly 900 troops, American troops as well as U.S. contractors in Syria. And at this point, there's no indication that these rebel forces pose any threat to them. But that is definitely something that U.S. officials are thinking about. One defense official today acknowledging that this shift overnight could potentially provide this window of opportunity to ISIS to resurge in activity. So that is definitely something that U.S. officials are watching now and in the coming days and weeks, Hallie.
Ali, thank you. I'm going to ask you to stand by as we wait now to hear from President Biden any minute. While we do, I want to bring in NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez, who is live for us now from Tel Aviv. Raf, this is a story we have been talking about for 2 weeks. As President Biden is walking out, I'm going to ask you to stand by, and let's listen in to President Biden speaking now from the White House.
The Middle East. After 13 years of civil war in Syria, more than half a century of brutal authoritarian rule by Bashar al-Assad and his father before him, rebel forces have forced Assad to resign his office and flee the country. We're not sure where he is, but there's word that he's in Moscow. At long last, the Assad regime has fallen. This regime brutalized and tortured and killed literally hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians. The fall of the regime is a fundamental act of justice. It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their proud country. It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty. As we all turn to the question of what comes next, the United States will work with our partners and the stakeholders in Syria to help them seize an opportunity to manage the risks. You know, for years, the main backers of Assad have been Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. But over the last week, their support collapsed, all three of them, because all three of them are far weaker today than they were when I took office. And let's remember why. After Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, 2023, when much of the world responded with horror, Iran and its proxies chose to launch a multi-front war against Israel. That was a historic mistake on Iran's part. Today, Iran's main territorial proxy, Hezbollah, is also on its back. Only 12 days ago, I spoke from the Rose Garden about the ceasefire deal in Lebanon, a deal that was only possible because Hezbollah has been badly degraded. Meanwhile, Hamas has been badly degraded as well. Iran's own military capabilities have been weakened. Iran tried 2 times to attack Israel, and the United States and built a coalition of countries to directly defend Israel and help defeat those attacks. All this made possible for Iran and Hezbollah to continue to prop up, impossible, I should say, for them to prop up the Assad regime. Additionally, Russia's support for Assad also failed. And that's because Ukraine, backed by our American allies, has put up a wall of resistance against the invading Russian forces, inflicting massive damage on the Russian forces. And that has left Russia unable to protect its main ally in the Middle East. Excuse my cold. The upshot for all this is, for the first time ever, neither Russia nor Iran nor Hezbollah could defend this abhorrent regime in Syria. And this is a direct result of the blows that Ukraine, Israel, have delivered upon their own self-defense with unflagging support of the United States. You know, over the past 4 years, my administration pursued a clear and principled policy towards Syria. First, we made clear from the start sanctions on Assad would remain in place unless he engaged seriously in a political process to end the civil war, as outlined by the UN Security Council resolution passed in 2015. But Assad refused, so we carried out a comprehensive sanction program against him and all those responsible for atrocities against the Syrian people. Second, we maintained our military presence in Syria, our counter-ISIS, to counter the support of local partners as well on the ground, their partners, never ceding an inch of territory, taking out leaders of ISIS, ensuring that ISIS can never establish a safe haven there again. Third, we've supported Israel's freedom of action against Iranian networks in Syria and against actors aligned with Iran who transported lethal aid to Lebanon. And when necessary, ordered the use of military force against Iranian networks to protect U.S. forces. Our approach has shifted the balance of power in the Middle East. Through this combination of support for our partners, sanctions, and diplomacy, and targeted military force when necessary, we now see new opportunities opening up for the people of Syria and for the entire region. Looking ahead, the United States will do the following. First, we'll support Syria's neighbors, including Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Israel, should any threat arise from Syria during this period of transition. I will speak with leaders of the region in the coming days. I had long discussions with all of our people earlier this morning. And I'll send senior officials from my administration to the region as well. Second, we will help ensure stability in eastern Syria, protecting any personnel, our personnel, against any threats, and will remain our mission against ISIS will be maintained, including the security of detention facilities where ISIS fighters are being held as prisoners. We're clear-eyed about the fact that ISIS will try to take advantage of any vacuum to reestablish its capabilities and to create a safe haven. We will not let that happen. In fact, just today, U.S. forces conducted a dozen of precision strikes, airstrikes, within Syria, targeting ISIS camps and ISIS operatives. Third, we will engage with all Syrian groups, including within the process led by the United Nations, to establish a transition away from the Assad regime toward independent, sovereign, independent, I want to say it again, sovereign Syria, with a new constitution, a new government that serves all Syrians. And this process will be determined by the Syrian people themselves. And the United States will do whatever we can to support them, including through humanitarian relief, to help restore Syria after more than a decade of war and generations of brutality by the Assad family. And finally, we will remain vigilant. Make no mistake, some of the rebel groups that took down Assad have their own grim record of terrorism and human rights abuses. We've taken note of statements by the leaders of these rebel groups in recent days, and they're saying the right things now. But as they take on greater responsibility, we will assess not just their words, but their actions. And we are mindful that there are Americans in Syria, including those who reside there, as well as Austin Tice, who was taken captive more than 12 years ago. We remain committed to returning him to his family. As I've said, this is a moment of considerable risk and uncertainty, but I also believe this is the best opportunity in generations for Syrians to forge their own future, free of opposition. It's also an opportunity though it's far from certain, for a more secure and prosperous Middle East, where our friends are safe, where enemies are contained. And it would be a waste of this historic opportunity if one tyrant were toppled and only to see a new one rise up in its place. So it's now incumbent upon all the opposition groups to seek a role in governing Syria, to demonstrate their commitment to the rights of all Syrians, the rule of law, and the protection of religious and ethnic minorities. These past few days have been historic. And it's in the days ahead that will determine the future of this country. And we intend to approach them with strength, wisdom, and resolve. So thank you very much. God bless America, and God protect our troops. Thank you.
What should happen to Assad now, Mr. President?
Mr. President, what does the U.S. know about that foreign released?
What does the U.S. know about where Austin Tice might be and if he's safe?
We believe he's alive. We think we can get him back, but we have no direct evidence of that yet. And Assad should be held accountable.
Have you directed an operation to go get him, Mr. President?
Is Assad in Moscow?
Get who?
Austin Tice.
We won't want to get him out.
Yes, sir.
We have to identify where he is. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
President Biden walking out of the room there, taking a couple of questions from reporters. In case you couldn't hear, he was asked about Austin Tice. President Biden saying they believe Austin Tice is alive. They need to find him and get him home. He was also asked about Bashar al-Assad and saying that Assad should be held accountable, in his words. You heard President Biden there from the White House talking about the fall of the Assad regime. And as we bring back in now our international correspondent, Raf Sanchez, who is live with us from the region, if there was a theme to the president's remarks just now, Raf, it seemed to be that this is a moment both of historic opportunity, as the president put it, but also a moment of great risk.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Hallie. President Biden saying that it is a fundamental act of justice that the Assad regime, after 50 years of brutal rule over Syria, has now been toppled, but also saying that the United States is clear-eyed about the rebel groups that overthrew him. He mentioned that some of these rebel groups, as he's put it, have a grim record of terrorism, but he also noted that they are, in his words, saying the right things. So let's put that in a little bit of context. The main rebel group most responsible for toppling Assad over this lightning offensive in the last 2 weeks is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It has its origins in al-Qaeda. It is considered technically a terrorist organization by the United States. And at the same time, it has been going to great lengths over the last 2 weeks to try to reassure the people of Syria and the world that it is not a sectarian organization, that it plans to be a responsible government of Syria. And President Biden indicating that the United States is keeping an open mind, that the rebels right now are saying the right things, but that the U.S. has not forgotten about their record. I thought the other big headline there, Hallie, President Biden saying that those 900 American troops, most of whom are up in the northeast of Syria, with a long-term but slightly ambiguous mission to prevent ISIS from resurging, will stay inside of Syria. He is not announcing any withdrawal. He says that they will hold their positions. And he says the United States is conscious that in this moment of chaos inside Syria, there is a potential vacuum for ISIS to regroup, which he says he will not allow. Slightly bigger picture, Hallie, I thought it was interesting. The president seemed to paint the fall of Assad almost as if it was the culmination of a long-time deliberate American strategy. He talked about how the U.S. has been unflagging in support of Ukraine, which has weakened Russia, unflagging in support of Israel, which has weakened Iran and Hezbollah. He says the U.S. has maintained these crippling sanctions on Assad, and that in some ways, that's how we got to where we are. I do think the reality, Hallie, is the events on the ground have stunned the region. They have stunned the United States. The battle lines in Syria appear to be largely frozen for the last 4 years. And then all of a sudden, like a lightning bolt, the rebels bursting out of northwest Syria, taking city after city, and in the early hours of this morning, rolling into Damascus, taking control of the capital city, and toppling the Assad regime. Hallie.
From a practical perspective, Raf, what does it look like for the process now of transition for the Syrian government to begin? You heard President Biden reference that, working with the United Nations, for example. How is that going to work?
So, Hallie, it is 10 p.m. in Damascus right now. The rebels have been in control for a little more than 12 hours. They are consolidating power there. They have established a curfew. They're setting up roadblocks. And we saw the leader of HTS, a man who I should say has a $10 million bounty on his head from the State Department, give a speech in this historic mosque in the center of Damascus, talking about how this will be a time of unity. So there will be an internal process inside of Syria. HTS, the largest, most powerful rebel group, will try to figure out how exactly it is going to share power with smaller rebel factions, with the Kurds, who are backed by the United States in the east of Syria. And we will see to what extent outside players will have a role here. It was notable that President-elect Trump, in his messages earlier, basically seemed to say the United States should stay out of this. It's up to Russia and, to a certain extent, China to shape the outcomes here. That is certainly not the message that you heard from President Biden. He didn't indicate that the U.S. was going to, deliberately try to tip the scales one way or another, but he did indicate that there will be American diplomatic engagement to try to ensure that there is a peaceful transition to a non-sectarian, non-dictatorial civilian government. He said also that a priority for the United States is bolstering Syria's neighbors, Jordan, Iraq, Israel, and making sure that the conflict doesn't spill over. I can tell you, Hallie, we're in Israel right now. The Israelis are not waiting around for the United States. They have taken a very assertive posture over the last 24 hours. They have sent their own troops into what used to be the buffer zone between Israel and Syria. And a monitor group based out of the UK says the Israelis have been bombing Syrian chemical weapons facilities to make sure that those deadly weapons do not fall into the wrong hands. Hallie.
Raf, I'm going to ask you to stand by. I want to bring back in Ali Rafa now, who's live at the White House. As Raf talks about the diplomatic process, Ali, one of the things we heard from President Biden is that in the remaining days that he has left in office, only just over a month at this point, he plans to send senior officials to the region to continue in this process, working with this now rebel leaders of Syria at this point. Do we know who that may entail, what that may look like yet?
Yeah, Hallie, that's still unclear. We expect to find out more specifically from the National Security Council later today. But I thought it was notable, as you mentioned, the president striking this hopeful for a better opportunity for Syrians tone, but also still very cautious and not outright supportive of these rebel groups who have now taken over Syria. And I thought it was also notable that he claimed somewhat of credit for why and the reason behind why they were able to do that, talking about the Biden administration's work behind the scenes over the last few years to weaken Syria's main supporters in Russia, in Iran, and Iran's proxy group Hezbollah, talking about the Biden administration's work just over the last year as it relates to the war between Israel and Hamas and the ceasefire now between Israel and Lebanon. I thought it was also important that he talked about those new opportunities in Syria. He committed to, as you mentioned, sending officials to this region to work on diplomatic ties, creating what he called a sovereign Syria with a new constitution that he says will be determined by the Syrian people themselves. Obviously, this is a very long to-do list for a president that has just a little over 40 days left in office. But as you mentioned, he is committing to doing this, and we've heard from Biden administration officials over the last few days that that work that they started will continue with the incoming Trump administration. We actually heard from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan yesterday that he, as well as the Middle East team in the White House, they are having conversations with their Trump team counterparts to ensure what Sullivan said would be a seamless and easy transition once President-elect Trump does take office.
Ali, Rafa, thank you very much. Rafa, let me go back to you, because when President Biden talks about accountability for Bashar al-Assad, obviously that begins with wherever Assad is now. Russian state media has suggested that he has been granted asylum in Moscow. If that is the case, it would not be at all surprising, right, that the Kremlin is essentially giving Assad a safe haven, at least for now.
Yeah, there's a certain irony, Hallie, that the Russian government was not there for Assad in his hour of maximum need, that his regime has collapsed, partly because Russia just wasn't able to step in from a military perspective, but they do seem willing to give him and his family asylum inside of Russia. As you say, the odds of him seeing any kind of international accountability now seem very, very low. Vladimir Putin himself is wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes allegedly committed in Ukraine. He is not heading to The Hague to sit in front of that court anytime soon. It is very, very unlikely, it seems, that Assad will be either. Hallie.
Raf Sanchez live for us in Tel Aviv. President Biden, as you just heard from the White House, addressing the nation on what appears to be the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, a move that will have dramatic developments, not just in the region, but well beyond, including here in the United States. We'll have a lot more coverage of this development as we conclude this NBC News special report, including more tonight on NBC Nightly News and throughout the day on NBCnews.com. Thanks for watching.
Inside Iran from Israel. From